DRIs, RDAs, AIs, oh my! How am I going to keep all of those acronyms straight? Take a deep breath, and I'll make sense of all that alphabet soup. The Dietary Reference Intakes, or DRI for short, are a set of standards specifying amounts for nutrients, energy, and physical activity that best support health for most disease-free individuals. These standards are not intended to be the absolute determining factor in a person's needs to thrive. They are just a starting point. For educational purposes, I am breaking the DRIs into 3 major categories. The first of which being micronutrients, which are vitamins and minerals. The second being macronutrients, which are carbohydrates, lipids, and protein. And the third being energy. Let's begin with the most confusing guidelines, the micronutrients. There are 4 sets of standards for vitamins and minerals that have evolved over the years. The first of which being the Recommended Dietary Allowances, or RDA for short. There are 19 nutrients at RDA values, which are useful in planning programs involving large groups of individuals like a school lunch program or the cyclical menu of a skilled nursing facility. The RDA values were established through classical clinical trials involving the depletion of a particular nutrient, followed by the repletion of that nutrient. These studies were then used to develop standards that would cover 97 to 98% of the population. So you wouldn't want to use these values for individual planning, but you could use them to compare the intake of a person and roughly determine if they are consuming reasonable amounts of these nutrients. Adequate intakes, or AIs, are created when there isn't sufficient data to create an RDA value, or EAR, which I'll talk about shortly. AIs are based off of observations and scientifically determined approximations rather than clinical trials. For example, the AI values for babies and children were determined from the analysis of breast milk in conjunction with adult requirements. No repletion-depletion studies were conducted for obvious ethical reasons. The Tolerable Upper Intake Levels, or UL for short, establishes the highest level of daily nutrient intake that is unlikely to have any adverse health effects for most people. It's important to note that the UL values are only established if there are sufficient data available. So, not all nutrients have a UL and are not automatically considered safe because no UL has been established. The Estimated Average Requirements, or EAR, establishes the average requirement of a nutrient so that half of the population would meet its needs while the other half would not. It is important to note that EAR development is associated with a specific body function like transketolase activity, a very important enzyme that requires adequate intakes of the vitamin thiamine. As you might have guessed it, the EAR is useful in evaluating populations rather than individuals. Coincidentally, the EARs was the starting point for developing the RDAs. To summarize, the RDAs, AIs, UL, and EAR are used to characterize the amounts of micronutrients, so vitamins and minerals, needed by the disease-free human body across the lifespan. Each of these were developed using slightly different scientific approaches, hence the confusing alphabet soup. This figure shows the relationship among these micronutrient categories on a normally distributed sample population graph, just like the bell curve from high school. The y-axis shows the population, and on the x-axis is nutrient intake. So, as we go from left to right, nutrient intake increases. The dashed line that bisects the middle or hump of the curve is the point where the average of the sample population occurs. If we graph all of the wonderful acronyms on the bell curve, you'll see the relative nutrient coverage of that specific standard within this sample population. For example, we discussed that the EAR value covers half of the population, while the RDA covers 97 to 98% of the population. That's precisely what we see on this graph. On a side note, the official DRI tables refer to minerals as elements. Now that's fancy talk. But wait, what about the macronutrients? The Acceptable Macronutrient Distribution Ranges, or AMDR for short, establish percent ranges for the intake of carbohydrates, lipids, and protein. Displayed here are the AMDR values for the macronutrients. What do you do with these data? Well, if you perform a dietary analysis on a person, you can compare their individual macronutrient percentages with the AMDR to identify any possible areas that might be predisposing them to disease. For example, if an individual is consuming a diet consisting of 40% lipids, then that person is likely at increased risk for cardiovascular disease. So you would educate the individual on strategies to help lower their overall dietary lipid intake. The DRIs also include macronutrient intake recommendations for individuals in grams per day. We have so many ways to analyze and compare someone's diet, don't we? Speaking of which, there are also additional macronutrient recommendations for dietary cholesterol, trans fat, saturated fat, and added sugars to be as low as possible in the diet. The estimated energy requirement, or EER, are the predicted levels of energy intake estimated to help maintain body mass based upon age, gender, height, weight, and physical activity. In summary, the dietary reference intakes are comprised of many components, each with their specific purpose in dietary analysis, planning, and modification. Just remember that the DRIs provide guidelines for macronutrient, micronutrient, and energy needs for disease-free, generally healthy people. Thanks for watching. Have a healthy and productive day.